It's a pleasure to see you all here today on a hot July Friday. It's a real testament to the importance of today's event, and it's with great pleasure that I introduce to you Assistant Secretary Robert Blake. Most of you, or many of you, know him and have had the pleasure of hearing him before. Secretary Blake is a career Foreign Service officer who has had extensive experience in the Middle East and in South Asia before coming to his current position as Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia. Prior to that position, in addition to various other postings, he served as Ambassador of Sri Lanka and the Maldives from 2006 until the time of his posting. It's a pleasure to turn the floor open to you for your comments and the questions I know you'll be happy to take.
Well, first of all, Martha, let me really thank you for, again, putting on a nice lunch and giving us the opportunity to talk a little bit. I don't have to tell all of you that Martha is one of the real great experts in Central Asia, so it's really been terrific to have her counsel, and we testified earlier this week in front of the Helsinki Commission as well. I really want to, let me add my own warm words of welcome to everybody here. As many of you know, I was out in the region last week with our Deputy Secretary of State, Jim Steinberg, for the OSCE Ministerial, and then we took the opportunity also to go to Tashkent and then to Bishkek, and after that to Osh. So what I thought I would do is just kind of maybe just start by giving a little bit about Central Asia and our overall policy, and then go into a little bit more about Kyrgyzstan itself and some of the things that we saw, and then we'd be glad to open up for questions and comments and so forth. As all of you know, Central Asia is a region of really significant importance to the United States and our national interests. Recognizing the uniqueness of each of the 5 Central Asian nations and their sovereignty and their independence, U.S. policy supports the development of fully sovereign, stable, democratic nations that are integrated into the world economy and cooperating with one another, with the United States, our partners, to advance regional security and stability. This has been our long-standing policy in the region, but how we pursue it has differed from administration to administration. So shortly after coming to power, the Obama administration undertook a full review of our policy towards Central Asia, and we decided on 5 main priorities, none of which will be any surprise to all of you. First, to expand cooperation with Central Asian states to assist coalition efforts in Afghanistan. Second, to increase development and diversification of the region's energy resources and supply routes. Third, to encourage political liberalization and respect for human rights. Fourth, to foster competitive market economies and economic reform. And lastly, to prevent the emergence of failed states, or in more positive terms, to increase the capacity of states to govern themselves effectively. To pursue all of these priorities, we decided to expand our civilian engagement with each of these countries and to establish consultative mechanisms with each of them to try to regularize our dialogues and channel them into realistic work programs that could really drive progress in each of the areas that I previously outlined. Soon after I took up my duties last summer, I traveled with Undersecretary of State Bill Burns, our Undersecretary for Political Affairs, on an interagency delegation to the region in what at that point had been the highest level civilian visit to the region in many years. And in his meetings, Undersecretary Burns proposed the establishment of these annual bilateral consultations that would be augmented by 6-month reviews. So all of our friends in Central Asia agreed to that proposal, and since that visit, I have chaired consultations with every one of the countries in Central Asia, except Kyrgyzstan. We were planning to have our annual consultations with the Kyrgyz in April, when, in fact, they arrived the day that the momentous events took place in Kyrgyzstan. So we naturally suspended those talks. But we hope to have those at some point. We've certainly had plenty of contacts with the Kyrgyz in the last several months. We've had some fun times. The poor Tajik foreign minister Zarifi, was here during the February snowstorms. So he spent an entire week waiting for the U.S. government to open up. We ended up having some of the consultations in my living room to have our talks. But I think that's emblematic of the good dialogue that we've had and the very serious dialogue. Almost every one of them has taken place over the course of 2 days, so we've really had a chance to get into real depth on all of the issues and priorities that we are each trying to advance. Now, all of you, or many of you, know much more about Central Asia and have been working on Central Asia a lot longer than I have. But you, I think, recognize that sometimes it can be a challenge to help move our Central Asian friends in the directions that we would like. But I think all of you would also agree that the first step in trying to get that kind of progress that we want to achieve is to create the right atmosphere and the right forms of dialogue. And I think that particularly includes creating the right atmosphere on these tough issues like human rights. And so we've tried to do that in a way of mutual respect and mutual understanding, so we can, again, really make progress on this. I think we are making progress in the area of human rights, and I'd be glad to come back to that because we really have made, in each of our annual bilateral consultations, an effort not only to include civil society components, but also to include business components. Our last visit to Turkmenistan that took place a little while ago, earlier this summer, it was our first ABC overseas, and I took with me a business delegation to Turkmenistan. I think it was quite a successful visit, and again, it underlined that we really want to have wide-ranging and broad progress on each of the areas that I outlined. I often read some commentary that the Obama administration is too focused on the security relationship with these countries and that we forget about human rights. And I know that makes for good news copy and good, maybe good blog bites, but I also want to tell you that that's wrong. This administration has not shied away from discussing in a very frank and a very full manner all of the human rights issues. Many of the ambassadors are from the Central Asian countries are here today, and they will not be surprised to hear me say that. My colleague Mike Posner, who's the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights and Democracy and Labor, has frequently co-chaired the sessions that we have on human rights and democracy, and he came out with me to Turkmenistan and to Uzbekistan on our most recent trip earlier this summer, to underline the importance that we attach to those particular issues. We also hear the charge from time to time that the United States is too interested in maintaining the transit facility at Manas Airport in Kyrgyzstan, and that therefore we refuse to criticize the Bakiyev regime about human rights. And again, I just want to assure all of you that we raised human rights in every single meeting that I attended, and that we were preparing for quite a robust discussion in April when the delegation was coming in here. We had planned to have a civil society component to the dialogue. We'd invited many of the civil society folks who are represented in this room to a session that I would have chaired with the foreign minister. So I think we do want to make progress in human rights, and we've said to our friends in each of these countries that, particularly as we want to expand security cooperation, that's got to go hand in hand with progress on human rights. Let me also just say another thing, which is that the United States is really not in competition with any other country over influence in Central Asia. I know many people talk about the great game, and again, I know that makes for good copy, but it really doesn't have much basis in reality. Our goal is to maintain mature bilateral relations with each of the countries in Central Asia based on our foreign policy goals and each of those countries' specific characteristics and dynamics. And again, we don't really accept any country having exclusive interests in any part of Central Asia. We do maintain that it's in the interest of all of the countries in the region to undertake policies that can produce a more durable stability and more reliable partners for everyone, including the United States, to address many of the critical challenges that are faced in the region, from nonproliferation to counter-narcotics, energy security, and combating terrorism. Before I conclude and open this up to questions and comments, let me just say a few words about the upcoming OSCE Summit that's going to be held in Kazakhstan later this year, and then just talk a little bit about the situation in Kyrgyzstan and what the Obama administration is doing about it. With regard to the OSCE Summit, as I said, I was part of Jim Steinberg's delegation that went for the ministerial that was held in Almaty earlier this month. And ministers there, as all of you know, discussed holding a summit later this year sometime in Astana under the chairmanship of the Kazakhstan chairman in office. This will be a truly historic event. This will be the first OSCE summit that's been held in Central Asia, and it'll be the first summit that's been held in 11 years. And it's our hope that this will shine a light on developments in Central Asia and the role that the OSCE has played and can play in promoting its principles across all three dimensions throughout the OSCE region. We think that Kazakhstan has done a very credible job as OSCE chairman in office, and I also would say in dealing with the situation in Kyrgyzstan, where the OSCE has been at the forefront of efforts to promote peace, democracy, and reconciliation. In offering to host this summit, Kazakhstan has agreed to follow the example of past summits and allow full access by NGOs, as happened in Istanbul in the last summit in 1999. And we think this is important not only so that Kazakhstan can demonstrate its commitment to upholding the human dimension, but also because this year marks the 35th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act. So I can assure you that at the summit, the United States will stand up for all of the OSCE principles, and especially with regard to human rights. On Kyrgyzstan, I think you all know the facts of the recent past. In April, there was a bloody uprising that overthrew President Bakiyev and brought in a provisional government. Clashes between ethnic Kyrgyz and ethnic Uzbeks in southern Kyrgyzstan in mid-June were really a very strong test for the government. During the violence, over 350 people were killed and about 400,000 were displaced, with roughly 100,000 of those going to temporarily to seek refuge in neighboring Uzbekistan. I think the situation has generally stabilized, but tensions remain very high in the south still. Humanitarian organizations down there are now transitioning from emergency relief to recovery and reconstruction, and most importantly to reconciliation. While we are encouraged that there's not been a recurrence of the violence, President Otunbayeva and the provisional government face very daunting challenges. Fears and tensions remain, particularly among the ethnic Uzbeks. As I said, I was in Osh last week, and I felt this myself in many of the conversations that we had with people where we just stopped on the street and had discussions with both ethnic Kyrgyz and Uzbeks. Since April, I've been there, in fact, several times, and have had many conversations with the provisional government leadership. We support a number of steps that we think should be taken to help heal the wounds of the past, but also help Kyrgyzstan to chart a more stable future. And let me just tick those off, and I'd be glad to elaborate on any of those later on. First, we think that we need to boost security forces in the south to prevent further violence, and that the principal and best mechanism for doing that right now is through the establishment of an OSCE police advisory group. Second, we're encouraging local Kyrgyzstani law enforcement and judicial institutions to act as reliable and credible community partners in order to build trust with the people. Third, we want to encourage investigations, both a domestic investigation and an international investigation, into the causes of the violence in June, both to help understand how to prevent fresh outbreaks of violence, but also to ensure accountability for those who are responsible. We also want to help Kyrgyzstan establish a functioning democracy in these very important parliamentary elections that are going to take place in early October. And last but not least, we want to help the people of Kyrgyzstan, particularly those in Ocean Jalalabad, to reconstruct their homes and reconstruct their lives before winter starts up. Earlier this week at the Kyrgyzstan Donors Conference, a host of international donors, including the United States, pledged $1.1 billion in response to a World Bank and government of Kyrgyzstan drafted joint economic assessment. The pledges exceeded the needs outlined in that assessment by $100 million, which I think is encouraging. The United States pledged $48.6 million, which comes on top of our existing annual assistance program. We joined the donors community in speaking with one voice in calling on the government to insist upon a fair plan to provide transitional housing to all those who lost their homes, to also provide a comprehensive international and domestic investigation into the recent violence, and also to support the planned OSCE Police Advisory Group. Finally, the crisis in Kyrgyzstan has also tested its neighbors, particularly Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. We are working with our partners in the region and with Russia so that there will be no repetition of these tragic events. Uzbekistan played a helpful role in taking in a large number of displaced persons, which contributed significantly to the international relief efforts. Its government quickly and effectively addressed the humanitarian needs of these people and ultimately helped to save a lot of lives. We hope that if needed, Uzbekistan would once again be willing to open its borders to provide a safe haven. We also appreciate Kazakhstan's efforts to galvanize the OSCE's efforts to help stabilize the situation in Kyrgyzstan. Kazakhstan supported the OSCE's decision to deploy a police advisory group in Kyrgyzstan. It has expressed its commitment to enhance the OSCE Center in Bishkek and the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR's, efforts to assist Kyrgyzstan with the parliamentary elections in October. As a very powerful economic neighbor, Kazakhstan has a crucial role to play in continuing to help Kyrgyzstan to achieve economic and social stability, including by maintaining its borders open and accepting some of the important agricultural exports that will now just be coming to harvest. As the international community works with the provisional government to help confront these many challenges, I think coordination and consultation are going to be really essential. The United States remains in constant contact with the governments in Tashkent and Astana, in Moscow, in the European Union, and of course the United Nations to help ensure the security and stability in Kyrgyzstan and proper coordination. The crisis has brought Russia and the United States together in a region where so many people often suggest that we are rivals. President Medvedev and President Obama have even issued a joint statement on Kyrgyzstan at their last meeting. So we think that's a good and promising basis to build on. So let me stop there, and I'd be glad to take your questions on any of what I've just talked about or anything else you'd like to talk about. Thank you very much, and again, a warm thanks to Martha and her colleagues for hosting us today.
Thank you. When you're recognized to ask questions, please identify yourself. Okay.
So I can decide whether I want to answer your question.
No, because this is, we'll start. Kathy.
Hello, I'm Catherine Fitzpatrick. I'm with EurasiaNet.
Hi.
I want to ask you, in making the agreement for the OSCE summit, did the U.S. raise any cases such as the case of Yevgeny Zhovtis or any other issues that you would like to see resolved before the summit? And did you get into the question of when the implementation meeting would be, because the precedent there has been to hold it well in advance of the summit? Thank you.
I don't want to get into specific cases in terms of what we discussed in our bilateral dialogue with our friends, but let me just say that we attach a great deal of importance, as my remarks attest, to making progress on human rights, including with Kazakhstan. I think Kazakhstan is aware that there's a certain amount of skepticism on the part of many members of the OSCE about insufficient progress that's been made in the area of human rights. So I think they're committed to trying to make some progress between now and the time of the summit. And they also are committed to hosting a human dimension review before the summit. So I hope that we can see progress between now and then. And let me also just say, in terms of the summit itself, we hope that there will be an NGO, a civil society component to that. And I think the Kazakhs have agreed in principle to do that.
Thank you very much. Mark Schneider, International Crisis Group. Specifically with respect to Kyrgyzstan and the recent violence in Ashen, could you give us your sense of the status of the police observer mission, both with respect to the issue of investigating the violence that occurred and actions which might be taken in addition to help prevent further violence? And I say that in light of the announcement or the press report, let's say, of the Kyrgyz community in Russia, in Moscow, opposing the police mission. I'd just be very interested in your views.
Yeah, I think the government is committed to seeing both a domestic investigation proceed as well as an international one that will be led by Kimmo Kiljunen, who is well known in the OSCE, but also somebody who's well known to the provisional government. We have encouraged Mr. Kiljunen to make sure that that he has the benefit of the advice of the UN and others who have a great deal of expertise in this area, and I think he's committed to doing that. I think that will help a lot to ensure that this really is a solid effort and a credible investigation that does take place. As you say, there is some resistance on the part of some in Kyrgyzstan to the deployment of a police advisory group. I think the OSCE is well aware of that, but also is counting on the support of the provisional government. I think that the president herself has expressed her support for this, as has key members of her government. So I think we and the OSCE and others will count on that to help ensure that there's a smooth deployment of this police advisory group, and that hopefully can take place as quickly as possible. We hope within a month or so, or maybe a little bit more than a month. But already efforts are underway to try to recruit the necessary people. And I can say that, speaking from the United States perspective, that we will provide both a robust part of the financial component of that, and we will also be contributing some, or we hope to contribute some of the police of our own.
Erica Murat, Russian Service, Voice of America. I have a question regarding the fifth priority of the U.S. policy.
Sorry, the what?
Fifth priority, the failed states, preventing failed states
yes.
priority. Where in the region do you see elements of failed state? Thanks.
Well, again, I don't want to put it in terms of failed states. I think several of the countries face, a lot of big challenges, and not the least because of the economic problems from the global recession, from the situation in Afghanistan. Tajikistan is obviously one country where we have been concerned. Their remittances account for almost half of their GDP, and remittances fell quite dramatically as a result of the economic situation in Russia. And so obviously they have some quite considerable economic challenges that they face, and that those are not helped by their proximity to Afghanistan, which makes it difficult to sometimes attract foreign investment. So the United States has worked hard to both to provide humanitarian assistance, but also we have again a robust bilateral aid program to help our friends in Tajikistan to help meet a lot of these challenges. And one of the really important ones also is in the energy side. And I don't have to tell you, there's been quite an important dispute with Uzbekistan over the Rogun facility. And again, that's something that I think is important to try to work our way through as quickly as possible and help provide a resolution to that so that they can meet their energy needs as quickly as possible in a way that will be acceptable to both of those countries.
Behind you.
I'm Andrew Pierre, Georgetown University. For the first time for me, I was in Kyrgyzstan last October, early November, actually sent by the State Department to talk about Obama's foreign policy. And I got a lot of feedback regarding the base in Manas. Already at that time, there's a sort of feeling that the U.S. government, and particularly the U.S. Embassy, I'm a great fan of Tatiana Gefeller, but nevertheless, the U.S. Embassy was too focused on that priority and not enough on sort of the overall relationship with Kyrgyzstan. And since then, of course, we've had the whole question of the oil and the contracts and so on. So my question is, what are we doing, or what is being done to sort out, to provide a little transparency, if you like, with regards to the fuel for the base? And important as our base there is, or our use of their airport is, what can be done to sort of diminish its profile in such a way that in Kyrgyzstan and Central Asia in particular is sort of more accepted?
Right. Thank you very much. That's a very good question, a very important question. And thank you also for being a speaker, because we really appreciate that. Let me answer that in two ways. First of all, I think I already addressed the human rights part of that, which is to say that human rights has always been a very important part of our dialogue and will continue to be so. And if you look at the public statements that I've made in all my visits to Kyrgyzstan and other senior level officials have made, that is always an important component of what we talk about. In terms of the base itself and the fuel contracts and so forth, we have made every effort to be as transparent as possible. The Department of Defense is now has competitively rebid the Manas fuel contract, and the Department of Defense and the U.S. government are committed to being as open and as transparent as possible about this, so that there are no kind of sweetheart deals that are cut under the table. We want to do this in a very transparent manner. We have posted information about the Manas Transit Center on the Embassy Bishkek's website, as well as information about the fuel contract. So again, we want to be as transparent as possible about this. In all of these cases, the Department of Defense has open competitive bidding processes, and again, we want to try to model that behavior, and we're making our best efforts to do so.
On the issue of reconciliation, what are the steps that have been discussed so far with the Kyrgyz government and also among the donor countries?
Identify yourself.
Regina Yan with the Eurasia Foundation.
Thank you very much. Well, as I said earlier, I think tensions are still very high in the South. So an important part of the reconciliation process will be first to just provide humanitarian assistance to help those who were displaced by the violence and make sure that they can, get back to their homes, be able to rebuild their homes as quickly as possible, and are supported, receive food and other assistance in the meantime while they're waiting for that. Secondly, as I said earlier, security is vital to this, and providing a more secure environment so that, again, the residents of Osh and Jalalabad can feel more safe is important. So we've put a lot of effort and into this deployment of this police advisory group. Third, I think there are a number of efforts that need to be made on the human rights side. There continue to be a lot of human rights abuses that we hear about and that people are well aware of. I met with many NGOs while I was there and human rights activists in Osh last week, and they talked about continuing reports of abuses in custody and arbitrary arrests and people coming into people's houses and beating children and things like that. So obviously all that's got to stop. I immediately raised all those concerns with the deputy commandant in Osh, whom I met with right after having that meeting with NGO activists. So again, I think it's very important that the government itself be aware of these and that they take steps to stop them. Last but not least, I think there is room now for efforts on the reconciliation to try to bring these communities together. So I know the OSCE is looking at various things that they could do. Many of the activists that we spoke to said that it's too early and emotions are still too raw to bring together the young men who were involved in much of the violence, but that perhaps there's scope to bring together women and mothers and the religious leaders. So the OSCE is looking at ways that they can do that, and that those groups of people can really serve as very important bridges between those two communities. So again, the OSCE, I think, is looking at ways to do that, and the United States would be pleased to try to support that.
Bill Veal from the U.S. Kazakhstan Business Association. In your opening remarks, you mentioned that among the topics from the consultations you'd be having with individual countries would be business issues.
Yes.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? I understand you've had this already with Turkmenistan, but in that particular vein of the bilateral talks, and then perhaps also I'd like your view of the idea of what might be happening with Basket 2 in the OSCE context in terms of maybe thinking about investment climate types of issues in the post-Soviet context here. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Bill. Again, in all of our annual bilateral consultations, I mean, obviously every country is different, but this is a very important part of our overall effort is to improve the business climate, not only for our companies who are already operating in many of those countries, but also to improve the investment climate for prospective investors so that they have greater incentives to try to come here and invest in those countries. We also think there are some important business opportunities, particularly in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. And so that's why we decided to take a delegation to Turkmenistan, to Ashgabat. And I think, again, there was quite a lot of progress. I'm looking forward to seeing your counterpart, Eric Stewart, to find out exactly, a month or two later what's really come of it. But there was a lot of MOUs and other things that were discussed, and there seemed to be a lot of optimism. So I just hope that we can now follow through on that. And I see that as a model for some of these other countries. When we have our next ABCs, both in Uzbekistan as well as in Kazakhstan, I hope we can do the same. Obviously, we're only going to do that if there's interest on the part of the American business community to do that. But we want to support you and all of your efforts. And I imagine there will be interest in the case of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So we look forward to again, putting together a robust delegation and, again, using that as an opportunity to try to encourage our friends in all these countries to improve the investment climate and provide opportunities for American companies, because I do believe there are significant opportunities. In terms of the OSCE part of it, I think that will be. I don't have anything concrete to tell you yet, but I definitely that's one of the high priorities is to use the summit for that purpose as well. Thanks.
Kathy Kosman, U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I had a question regarding Uzbekistan. Yes. I had a question regarding Uzbekistan. While you and others have praised Uzbekistan for its reception of the refugees from Osh and Jalalabad, nevertheless, other aspects of the Uzbek human rights record leave a lot to be desired. And while Uzbekistan was named a country of particular concern for its maltreatment, to put it mildly, of religious believers, and its general law on religion and many other aspects, I was wondering when the CPC state decision will be issued again, and whether, as the Commission hopes, Uzbekistan will again be named a CPC.
I can't give you any specifics on the timing of the CPC. I'm just not quite sure, but that's something that our colleagues in DRL, Mike Posner and others, could probably tell you. But I can tell you that on our recent visit, that this was a very important topic of concern that Mike and I raised with the government of Uzbekistan. And again, I think this is one of several areas where we see as a very high priority, and we hope that we can make progress.
Grant Smith, the Central Asia Caucasus Institute. To pick up on an earlier comment of yours, do you see a role for the U.S. in helping the countries of the area come to an agreement on further development of their water resources, which is a potential flashpoint after all? Or is this something that's best done by multinational organizations? And do you see a necessary financial component there, remembering that an earlier agreement, the Indus Waters Agreement, although somewhat different, did involve a substantial financial component?
Well, Grant, thank you for that question. I don't have to tell you that water is one of these very controversial and divisive issues, not just in Central Asia, but also in South Asia. But it's also something that I think we need to try to grapple with, because it becomes very quickly a national security issue in many of these countries, particularly now with many of the changes that are taking place as a result of climate change. So these problems of water supply, I think, are going to grow over time in all parts of the South and Central Asian region. So it's incumbent upon the United States and other donors to do what they can to try to help. As you say, in almost every case, a lot of this is going to require cooperation among the countries themselves. In the first instance, we support the efforts of the UN office in Ashgabat, which Ambassador Yencha, who's doing quite a terrific job to work with the countries to see what can be done to advance a water agenda between many of these countries. As I mentioned earlier, there are some quite ticklish issues in places, for example, between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and those are probably best addressed not in public forum like this. But the United States has supported a feasibility study that's called for the support of an independent feasibility study that would be conducted by the UN and paid for by the UN to take a look at some of the issues surrounding Rogun. And the Uzbeks, for example, are very concerned that this is going to be built in a seismically active area. So I think that deserves a close look. They also want to make sure that it's the right way to go to build a big dam and not a series of smaller dams. I think that's a fair point that deserves a close look as well. So, and I think also we want to see how this is going to benefit both of these countries. As always, any downstream country is going to be concerned about its vulnerability to supply disruptions from upstream. So there needs to be some sort of mechanism. In the Indian-Pakistani context, the World Bank has a mechanism under the Indus Water Treaty that provides such a mechanism, and both countries have availed themselves of that many times in the 50-year history of the treaty. And I think that's done a lot to reduce water tensions between them. But even then, they're still very high. But they're high not because of these bilateral disputes. They're high because populations are growing and water needs are growing very fast, and the resource is diminishing. So that's a long way of saying that I think probably the best progress can be made through institutions like the UN. And if we can support their efforts, we'll be glad to do so. I think we will be doing so in a modest way. And then if there are things that we can do on a bilateral basis with friends like the Tajiks and the Uzbeks to try to narrow differences, we'd be glad to do that.
Louise Shelley, George Mason University. There's been a lot of discussion that there were drug conflicts behind the conflicts in the south of Kyrgyzstan. And this is a problem that affects all of Central Asia. You haven't mentioned this as one of your policy concerns in the area, and I wanted you to develop this more.
Well, there are a lot of different issues. I mean, I probably couldn't name them all, but that's definitely one of them. There's there's a drug trafficking network that comes right up from Afghanistan and through many of the Central Asian states into Russia, and that's of great concern to all of those states and also of great concern to the Russians and to the United States, since a lot of these funds still go to people in Afghanistan and into that help to sustain some of the Taliban and others. So this is a very important concern, and it's something that we look at closely. And I think one of the things that that needs to be done now in Kyrgyzstan in particular is to try to bring that under control, because I think part of the sort of toxic mix that you saw in the violence in June was because of criminal gangs who were part of this violence, and then certainly some of their money is derived from the drug trade. So I think that is a very important component to it, and I think one of the things that can be done is to help Kyrgyzstan to revamp its own drug control agency and take a kind of stronger stand itself on some of the challenges that it faces.
Anders Åslund, Peterson Institute. I would like to take this opportunity to ask you to elaborate a bit upon the U.S. policy stand on the events in Kyrgyzstan on the 7th of April. That very day, Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev both came out and strongly condemned the Bakiyev regime for corruption, nepotism, and authoritarianism. While the U.S. somewhat later, you and others made the statements at a much lower level, saying that it was important to keep peace. And the Kyrgyz media reported, at least for the first 3 days, that the U.S. ambassador refused to talk to anybody from the new government. Could you elaborate a bit on this? Thank you.
I must say your memory is much better than mine about the exact unfolding of events in April, so I can't really comment on what our ambassador may not have said. But as in all of these crises, our first responsibility is to the security of our American citizens, and that's both private Americans but also our own embassy. So in the first days of any such crisis, that's exactly what we were focused on, is to make sure that the personnel at the U.S. Embassy, the personnel at Manas, and the personnel, other Americans in places like Osh and others were safely accounted for. And so there was a great deal of effort in that regard. I don't recall that the United States was particularly quiet about some of the events there. I think we expressed our public concern about things and, again, called for a quick resolution to the situation. And as we all remember, it was extremely fluid at that time, and I don't think any of us quite knew what was going on. So it sort of difficult to make comments about individuals and so forth.
I'm Dana Marshall with Dewey and LaBeouf, and the question is on Iran sanctions. I wonder if you could elaborate to the extent that you can. I know this is probably a sensitive area. The degree of commitment that you're picking up among the countries of Central Asia about working with the United States, with the EU now, and many other countries along these directions. Are they committed to the UN side of this? Are any of them planning to go beyond the UN, as the United States and the EU and others have done? Where are some of the problems or the opportunities that we may be able to leverage their cooperation to move forward on our objectives?
I have to say that in terms of the sanctions themselves, I haven't heard any suggestion that any of these countries are not going to abide by their UN obligations as member states to observe and implement the sanctions. So I expect them to do that, and I have no indication that they won't. I think the kind of larger question is the concerns I've heard from several of the states, and I don't want to name them because, as you say, it's very sensitive, but about what they see as the implications for the region of an emboldened Iran if it does, in fact, acquire nuclear weapons. So I think they're very conscious of that and very worried about that, and agree with the approach that the United States and others have taken to try to do everything we can to limit the ability of the Iranians to acquire nuclear weapons and to make sure that if there is a nuclear program, that it's a peaceful civilian program that's conducted under the auspices of the IAEA with full access by the IAEA.
Karen Saunders, George Mason University. Returning to Kyrgyzstan, I wonder if you could comment on what's being done to balance the need to open borders to allow refugees to cross into Uzbekistan and other countries on Kyrgyzstan's borders, with the need to increase border security to prevent illicit trade, human trafficking, human smuggling, and things of this nature.
Well, as I say, that was more of a concern during the violence in June, where again we commended and continue to commend the government of Uzbekistan for opening its border very quickly and for receiving the almost 100,000 refugees in a very professional manner. And I myself had the opportunity to visit the Fergana Valley and to go and see many of the camps that have been set up in a very short time. The government of Uzbekistan also welcomed the UNHCR after a hiatus of 5 years. Which, again, I think was very positive, and they continue to work, I think, productively with the UNHCR. So that's a kind of continuing good sign. But as I said earlier, we hope that if there is a recurrence of violence, that the government of Uzbekistan will, again, open up its borders and allow people to cross over into safety, and that they will, again, work with the international humanitarian aid organizations to provide assistance. But it's impossible to predict if that's going to happen or when. And I think the government is committed to trying to do that. As you know, Osh is only 4 miles from the border, so it's very short, and that's the natural place that people would probably seek refuge. Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
What is being done to balance the need for some openness or relaxing restrictions at the border at times with illicit trade, human trafficking?
Yes. I think the second part of that question, I think our friends in Kyrgyzstan are most concerned perhaps about the border with Tajikistan and the possibility, particularly in Batken, that, again, narco trafficking and perhaps human smuggling. I haven't heard of human smuggling, but that's certainly not unusual. And other kinds of illegal activities and terrorist activity could come across that border. And so I think, and that's not because of any ill will on the part of Tajikistan. It's just a difficult border to patrol and to control. So I think that is a particular priority in terms of trying to improve border security.
Any hands? If I didn't, I have a question.
Please.
Okay, and then we will thank you. You set forward an ambitious agenda for the U.S. and for the international community in Kyrgyzstan, and including the introduction of OSCE police, which is going to take time to achieve, these various commissions, national and international, and now this promise of over $1 billion of international assistance to be staged over almost 3 years. In each case, the solutions, the proposed solutions, assume time is frozen to some degree, which is why I think, having had the opportunity to share so many platforms with you, I think you've kept saying, if unfortunately violence resumes. The situation, though, is far from static. Today, the mayor of Osh received an award voted by the city council of Osh, making him hero of Kyrgyzstan, I'm sure, if I have the title correct, and to other people for what they've done to stabilize the situation in the region. That same city council, and this was all done with President Otunbayeva's presence in the city, or she was about to land in the city because she's in the south. It was a manifest statement of power on their part. The same city council has said it's against the police being brought there. And the assistance packages, some of them will require parliamentary approval, and we don't even have a date for the parliamentary election, let alone the election, because some of the longer-term money obviously requires somebody to take financial responsibility for it. the whole humanitarian assistance in the U.S. policy talks about getting people back to their homes, but next week even, I think they begin building high-rises on some of the property that was held by Uzbeks. I mean, that was historically owned by these people that they were kicked out of at the time of the riot. So by the time the assistance money comes for resettling people, there will already have been ditches dug, if not foundations laid. I don't think even the top priority construction teams in Osh can get high-rise apartments up in 8 weeks, but they can certainly do enough foundation laying to make it very, very difficult to resettle people. What kind of mechanisms, what kind of international mechanisms, what kind of U.S. policy initiatives can be done both to monitor the situation and try to pressure the various sides? I mean, there's national reconciliation between Kyrgyz and Uzbeks, but there's also national reconciliation between the various leaders in Kyrgyzstan, southern politicians and northern politicians, politicians who may have been members of Bakiyev's party, but were not intimate or family members of the Bakiyev team. It seems like there's a whole lot of other reconciliation that needs to be done. Some can be done maybe through the auspices of the OSCE. So I would really appreciate, and I'm sure a lot of people would appreciate, those of us here that spend a lot of time on Kyrgyzstan, what thoughts you have about future U.S. roles that could be played, or what the U.S. might want to see other international institutions do to help build bridges in this very difficult time. Thank you.
Well, Martha, those are all, very good questions, and I don't think anybody has any good answers to them, to be honest. I mean, I think your very good questions underline how delicate the situation is right now, and what a difficult challenge President Otunbayeva and her team face in trying to assert their authority over the situation in the South. And I'm encouraged I actually asked that question of somebody in Kyrgyzstan while I was there, and they said that President Otunbayeva actually has one important advantage right now, which is that there is something of a vacuum, because all of the senior previous ministers who were in the original provisional government that was formed after the events in April, all of them have now resigned because they're going to run for office in the parliamentary elections. So she and she has a certain measure of legitimacy as a result of this referendum that took place. So she now has the popular support through this referendum to be the president and the interim president for the next year and a half. So she does have a measure of legitimacy, and I think she also has the support of key individuals like the Minister of Interior and others who are committed to helping her and are committed to, I think, helping to assert their authority over the situation in the South. But I think they themselves would also be the first to acknowledge this is not going to be an easy thing for them to do. And so they will need our support. And I think institutions like the Police Advisory Group can help. But I think also, more importantly, it'll just be very, very important for the United States and Kazakhstan and Russia and other friends to continue to work very closely together with groups like the EU and the UN to make sure that we try to work in a balanced way to support President Otunbayeva, to make clear that we're not trying to mediate between any of these different groups who want to support the reconciliation between all of the communities. But again, I think we're all very conscious of the delicacy of the task ahead and the importance of moving quickly, but also moving carefully, so that we don't kind of upset some of these very difficult situations there. And I think nobody underestimates the possibility for new violence, which is why these investigations are so important to understand what was originally the cause of that violence. And I think it also underlines why having even a relatively small police advisory group on the ground in Osh and in Jalalabad will help not only to kind of discourage potential future violence, but also help to assure, I think, some of the citizens on the ground there about the role of the international community. But again, I don't want to underestimate the very difficult challenges that lie ahead, and so let me just leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.